But the more important part of the incarnation comes from what the fundamental purpose was. And that, of course, is the cross of Christ. You see, the conceptual value of humanity is not the stopping point, that we have a conceptual value, that, yeah, we have value because God created us on purpose. That isn't the stopping point for the Christian. The incarnation and where it led, and indeed its very purpose, tells us something deeply impactful. So I want to go back to my friend's question to me to illustrate this. He asked me, how can I get past this issue? My mother died when I was 10. How can I believe there's a God who cares and who's all-powerful and all-loving? I heard your argument that it's possible that any instance of suffering could derive for a greater possible good, but I'm asking you specifically, how can I know I have value, or my mother has value, given her death at a premature age, and that I had to suffer through this all these decades now? The Christian message is this, that you and I have rebelled against God. We have specifically said, we don't want your relationship you've offered to us. We want our own way. We want to be God ourselves. So we reject him. Yet, because he loves us and values us, despite our lack of value for ourselves, he says, I will redeem you. A payment is necessary because you have infinitely sinned against an infinite God. You have offended an infinite God, which requires, at least for him to be holy and just, requires some kind of punishment. Yet I love you enough to not make you pay for it. So I need a payment, but I need to forgive. How do I do both? The cross is exactly that. The cross is the payment and the forgiveness at the same time. It's payment because Jesus says, willingly, I will take it on, much like a guarantor would do in the law. I will take on the debt. I will pay for his debt. That's what he does. He does that, and that's perfectly just. But it's also a forgiveness because God lets it happen that way. But here's how I answered my friend. I could have gone into philosophy and gone to all these things, but I knew that that wasn't going to do it today. I could have said, God works in mysterious ways and he allows certain suffering for greatest possible goods. One day you'll see it. This is what I said to him. This is why Christianity is unique, because any theist can rely on the logic of the possibility that God allows any instance of suffering for a greater possible good in the future. Who knows when? I don't have to rely on theory as a believer in Christ. I actually have history to tell me that it actually happened. At the cross, Jesus died a criminal's death. He died unjustly. He was not supposed to, he was not guilty of the crimes that committed him. He was not blaspheming. He was not a sinner, yet he died a criminal's death. God could have stopped it. The Bible specifically tells us, Jesus says, if I wanted to stop this, it could happen like that. God lets a terrible suffering, a terrible evil happen to his son, not for a greater possible good, but for the greatest possible good, the salvation of the entire world. I don't need theory to tell me that it's possible. I can tell you based on the historicity, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, that it actually happened already. It actually already happened. So if I can trust that he would let his own son suffer, then maybe there's a reason why my friend is suffering, why I have suffered certain losses, why I have suffered certain pain, and why you have suffered certain pain. Because you have value to God. Now, I know this because, think on this, we want to have intrinsic value. We want to know we have value. If value is determined by how much we pay for something, then you have infinite value, because the infinite God paid an infinite price to spend infinity with you. That's how you know human beings have intrinsic value. I know of no other way to calculate it, to find it out. There's no other way. No other worldview tells you this. Humanism is the idea that human beings have intrinsic value. The cross tells you that you have it, and it proves it to you. David Bentley Hart, in his book, Atheist Delusions, he says this about where real humanism actually is, that secular humanism is a contradiction in terms, because you can't have and objective value of human beings without God. He says, what for us is the quiet, persistent, perennial rebuke of conscience within us was, for ancient peoples, an outlandish decree issuing from a realm outside any world they could conceive. Conscience, after all, at least in regard to its particular contents, is to a great extent a cultural artifact, a historical contingency, and all of us today in the West, to some degree or another, have inherited a conscience formed by Christian moral ideals. For this reason, it is all but impossible for us to recover any real sense of the scandal that many pagans naturally felt at the bizarre prodigality with which the early Christians were willing to grant full humanity to persons of every class and condition and of either sex. In other words, in the day when Christianity formed, personhood was not considered universal. People did not have universal personal rights. It was a bizarre concept to everyone around them. Christianity changed that. The point is that the West, to what we think is self-evident, that we all have inalienable rights and that we're all created equal, that's self-evident to us only because we live in a world that's saturated with Christian ideals. And those Christian ideals come from the transcendent, that God transcendently valued every human being because God so loved the world, not just certain people, but the whole world, that he gave his only begotten Son. God the Son comes to earth in Jesus, forsaking the majesty of heaven, exchanging the form of God for the form of a servant to achieve salvation for us. That's how you know intrinsic value exists. And that's how you know that humanism is fully realized, is fully actualized in the Christian message and in no other message available to us.